uh, Thinking this morning, I guess the small group we have triggered this in my mind where Living Hope, they had the pews packed full and chairs in the back, and that seemed normal. And then we move out here, and having a small group seemed abnormal for a little bit, and then we kind of got used to that. And now this morning we have even a smaller group, so that seemed a little bit abnormal as well. But regardless, kind of a moot point, just what was going through my mind. But just want to, extend greetings in Christ's name this morning. And just ask that you would pray for the message. The title of the message, I titled it The Price of Living. And it's going to be anchored in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 33, with verse 28 being the key verse. And verse 28 says, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it?" And in this context that Jesus spoke these words, there were a lot of people following Jesus. And these people had motivations, and there were a lot of different motivations. Some of the motivations were they wanted to see Jesus perform miracles. They were following him purely for interest's sake. Other motivations were that they hated Jesus and were trying to find fault with him. Other people believed that he was a Messiah, and they were following him out of a sincere desire to learn more about him, and out of a desire to follow him because he is a Messiah. And so Jesus was telling these people, he said, you need to count the costs. If you want to be a true follower of me, there's a cost associated with that. And you need to count the costs. You need to sit down first and figure out whether you are willing to pay the price. That was what Jesus was telling these crowds by making this statement. So have you ever considered what it costs you to live? You know, what is the cost of staying alive? Have you ever considered the amount of effort that you go through daily to sustain your physical life? Our bodies consist of a lot of different parts and a lot of different organs. And the more you learn about the body, the more intriguing it is, the more amazing it is how God spent so much time creating not so much, I shouldn't say that. God didn't spend much time creating us. How he put so much thought, I would say, into how our bodies should be put together. Our bodies really are an amazing specimen, I guess would be one way to put it. And because there are so many different parts of our body, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with our bodies. And there are things that can simply put us sideways for a short period of time where we might be sick. Or there are things that can go wrong with our bodies that can end our lives, can kill us. And there are things outside of our bodies that can kill us. You know, people die in accidents every day to where their body is damaged in some fashion that it ends their life. It kills them. So we were all born with a strong will to live. That's natural. We have a desire to live. We have a desire to stay alive. We have a healthy fear of death. And we instinctively go through great lengths to stay alive. Fear is actually our friend in some senses. God created fear as an internal mechanism, you might say, to help keep us alive, because it instinctively warns us of threats to our well-being. That's the purpose of fear. Most of us, we don't fear being 3 feet off the ground. Like I walk over the edge of this platform and it might be 2 feet, 1.5 feet to the ground. I don't fear that. Okay? Most of us don't fear being on I don't think anybody fears being on this platform unless it's to do some public speaking, then we fear it, but it's not for the heights. But if it was 30 feet down and I stood on the edge like this, that's an entirely different story. If it was 30 feet down and I'm standing like this, okay, there's going to be a degree of fear. If we're in 3 feet of water, I don't know if a bathtub is even 3 feet tall, but that's maybe a bathtub full of water. We're not afraid of a bathtub full of water. But if that's 30 feet of water, it feels entirely different. Why is that? The reason it feels different is because 30 feet of water has a potential to kill us. We can drive down Sundown Road, travel down Sundown Road, doing 65 miles an hour, and it feels natural. There's nothing abnormal about it. We feel safe. But if you double that speed, let's say you go 120 or 130 miles an hour, most, if not all of us, are going to feel some degree of, at the least, some apprehension. Because we're going 130 miles an hour down this road. What changes? What changed inside of us emotionally is the fact that we are at a heightened risk of danger. We're at a heightened risk of dying, of being killed. So, fear helps keep us alive. So whether we're dealing with heights, whether we're dealing with deep water, or whether we're driving, there's precautions we can take to reduce or eliminate the risk associated with whatever it is that we're doing. So if we're at a height, say we're on an observation deck. We were down in the Smokies, and there's I forget what it's called. If I could remember the name, you would know what I'm talking about. But it's a long, winding walk. Well, first you hike up you drive up a grade for, I forget how far. Boy, I wish I could remember. It's actually pretty remarkable. The distance that I coasted, where I just put the van into neutral and coasted for miles and miles, because it's just uphill, uphill, uphill. Well, when you finally get to the pinnacle, then there's this observation deck, and it's a winding walkway to get up to the observation deck. Well, as long as you're behind those safety rails, you're safe. But if you're going to jump off that observation deck, you're going to die. So we're at a height, we're at risk, but as long as we're behind those rails, we're safe. If we're working on a roof, if you stay behind the safety lines, you're in a safe area. Or you tie off. If you're working with too steep of a slope, then you need to tie off so you don't slip and fall. If we're on a boat, we wear a life vest. A life vest is what we do to reduce the risk. All of that is a price that we pay to stay alive. It costs us something. If nothing else, inconvenience. And I never wore a seatbelt growing up. I don't know about the rest of you, and for the youth, the intermediates here and the younger ones, whether you wear seatbelts or not. But I know I didn't. I actually never wore a seatbelt until my wife is the one that trained me to wear a seatbelt. I don't know if she even knows that or not, but that's who taught me to wear a seatbelt. And you can get used to wearing a seatbelt after a while. But it's not the most convenient thing to do. That every time you call a vehicle, it kind of comes natural actually, but every time you get in a vehicle, you clip your seatbelt on. So it's not necessarily convenient. But neither is listening to the alarm with its annoying beep if you decide not to wear it, or if you're riding with somebody that's not wearing it. So regardless, we may wear a seatbelt for 30 years, and we're never in an accident, nothing ever happens. For 30 years, technically, this seatbelt did us no good. Until one day, we're in an accident, and the seatbelt saves our lives. Wearing that seatbelt for 31 years or whatever, that's the price that you paid to stay alive in that accident. Staying alive is a choice. It's a conscious choice. If we do nothing, you just simply did nothing, what's going to happen? You're going to die. That's what's going to happen. So to sustain our lives, there's things that we must do. Most of that we actually do without even thinking about the fact that we're doing it, or we do it without thinking about why we're doing it. Fever. Having a fever is not a pleasant experience. I don't enjoy being sick. I don't think any of us enjoy being sick. But is fever the problem? The answer is no, fever is not the problem. The problem is that your body has either an infection or an illness, and fever is a side effect of your body fighting this infection and illness. It sends, from what I understand, limited knowledge, online research, it sends white blood cells out into your bloodstream, which attacks whatever this illness or infection is that you have, which is the cause of the fever. So fever is not the problem. The problem is the illness or infection that is invading your body, that is trying to kill you. So having a fever is a price that you pay to stay alive. But it's not pleasant. Phil Bauman, we all know Phil Bauman. So he was diagnosed with cancer. All right, so when somebody is diagnosed with cancer, they're usually given a range of options as far as treatment goes. Phil had a choice. And the two most obvious choices were, one, he could do nothing and his cancer would take his life. Or Phil could take chemotherapy, which comes with side effects, and potentially save his life, preserve his life. So Phil chose to take the chemotherapy. He was willing to deal with the side effects. He was willing to be sick from chemotherapy. He was willing to lose his hair from chemotherapy. It was a price that Phil was willing to pay to live. If we wouldn't eat for an extended period of time, what would happen? We would all die from malnourishment. That's what would happen. To stay alive, our bodies need nutrition, so we eat. And when we eat, we consume food. Our bodies, today we have a fellowship meal, all right? So we're going to go downstairs and we're going to eat. Well, when we eat, the food enters our stomach and into our digestive system. And our body takes this food and breaks it down and extracts the nutrients, the proteins, and the minerals and puts it into our bloodstream. And that's the way that our body is fed. It nourishes our body. That's the way that we stay alive. So eating, for all of us, I think, it's hardly a sacrifice. We enjoy eating. But taking the time to eat whatever, going through the effort to eat, that's a price that we pay to live, to stay alive. And to have access to food. We must either grow all of it on our property, in our gardens. We must raise our own cattle for beef, or raise our own chicken for eggs, or whatever it is. So that's one option. Or we must have the financial resources to buy it. Or maybe a combination of both. So that's another thing we can do. But either way, food isn't something that just magically appears on our table. It takes effort to get the food onto our table and to prepare it. What does it take to generate financial resources? There are many ways to generate income, but regardless of how you do it, generating income takes mental and physical exertion. One or both. The money you have and the assets that you have are a result of the time and energy that you invested into generating the money and the assets. That's a price that you're willing to pay to live, because without your financial resources, surviving is going to be much more challenging. Walter, I'm not sure if I should give his full name, but anyway, Walter was an elderly man. He lived in central Pennsylvania. This was in 2018. And he was in his 80s, but despite his advanced age, Walter still enjoyed hunting. And so this was October of 2018. One afternoon, mid-October, Walter decides he's going to go bow hunting with his crossbow. So Walter takes his crossbow, and he goes to his truck, climbs in his truck, just like all of us would. We're going hunting. So he drives to a public hunting area. And he parks on the south side of the road, gets his equipment, walks down the road, crosses the road, winds back through the woods, and he walks down through this creek bed, you might say. And the water was shallow enough that he walked through the water and up the bank, and on the other side of this bank, Walter had a tree stand. That's where he hunted, and people knew that that's where Walter hunted. But as many people, like I said, he's in his 80s, and many people in their 80s didn't adapt to technology the way that those of us do that are a bit younger. And he was one of those. He didn't like technology. He didn't want to have much to do with technology. So he didn't use it. Well, that afternoon that Walter went hunting, what he didn't know was that there was a severe weather system moving across the northern tier of Pennsylvania. And that actually included western Pennsylvania. I don't know if you recall the nursing home up in Connettville, that building was damaged in this storm. So this storm comes through northwestern Pennsylvania, travels down through the northern half of the state. Walter didn't know it was coming because he didn't check the weather digitally before he left. So Walter's in his tree stand, here comes the storm. And I forget how many inches it rained. There was a tornado in areas as an effect of that storm. And so he's sitting in his tree stand, this massive rainstorm comes and just dumps large volumes of water in a very short period of time, which drenched him. And so I'm not sure at what point he decided to leave, whether it was dark or it was before dark, but probably after the storm. At some point, Walter left his stand and decides to go back home. Well, he comes to the creek, and what was a creek that you could just walk down and across was now a raging, almost like a little small river, you might say. So he was in a dilemma. He couldn't cross the creek. And this creek traveled for miles through this game lands, and there was thousands of acres in this game lands. So he couldn't cross the creek, so what does he do? He decides the only option he has is to find a way around this creek. In the process, he gets lost. And he doesn't come back, so his family eventually reports that he's missing. And so there's this massive search for Walter. And we were still fairly new at search and rescue at the time, and we couldn't hardly beg our way into a search at that time. But finally, it was day 9 we got in on that search. They let us in. And we didn't find him on day 9. And I went into the command center toward the evening and asked them what their plans were for the next day, and they said they're shutting it down. They're done searching. They're shutting it down. But we still had a few assignments which we were working through, and then they called me and said, hey, if you can get us enough guys to search tomorrow, we'll go one more day. So I said, okay, we've got 10 guys for you. And they said, okay, we're going to search one more day. And that's what they did. And on the 10th day, Walter was found, but he was deceased. And some of these details might be a bit morbid, but anyway, he had died from hypothermia. When they found him, he was missing some of his clothing items. And what had happened was when you're suffering from hypothermia, it finally gets to the point where your brain interprets the extreme cold as heat. And so somebody that's on the latter stages of hypothermia, getting close to death, will feel like they're hot. And so they start shedding their clothes. And that's what Walter did. And until finally he died. And I'll get to more of that later. I'm trying to making a point. So the winters in Iowa, as we know, can be brutal at times. So what would happen if you wore your summer clothes in the winter and you went outside for the same length of time that you did in the summer? You would die. We would die. Even with winter clothing, we can only survive for... Well, there are people, I'm sure, that could put on a set of winter clothes, and in the fall they could walk out the door and return the next spring alive and well. There's people that can do that. But for most people, even with clothing, the proper winter clothing, we would struggle to survive the entire winter.